It was a shock. However much you try to prepare yourself for something like this, it still hits hard. It is a shock. We are all trying to process it. It is very, very sad. Prince Edward did not raise his voice. He did not need to. With one carefully measured confirmation, a private family crisis became a succession earthquake. The Duke acknowledged that Prince Harry and his children had been removed from the active line of succession, drawing Edward and his family dramatically closer to the crown. What left the people around him speechless was not simply the change itself, but the unmistakable suggestion that this decision had already been made. Not in that room. Not on that day. Edward had entered Windsor carrying the weight of a decision he had not created but could no longer avoid. Senior officials had briefed him beforehand, every word chosen with care. The line of succession, the formal structure identifying who stands next in line to inherit the crown, was no longer being treated as untouchable. The matter had become the center of a family crisis, and Edward understood that one sentence would change everything. The confirmation was brutally specific. Harry, Archie, and Lilibet were no longer included in the active succession order. As Andrew, Beatrice, Eugenie, Edward, and his children moved upward, Edward felt no triumph. His family's gain had come through his nephew's loss, and that awareness made every pause in the room heavier than it should have been. He had spent years trying to stay clear of the rupture between Charles and Harry, and now he was standing directly between them. Charles received the confirmation moments later. He read through the page once, then again, and set it on the table without saying a word. The king understood why the change mattered institutionally, but the father behind the title could not escape what those absent names represented. Harry was not simply a constitutional problem. He was his son. Archie and Lilibet were his grandchildren. The silence in that room carried more pain than any argument could have. Edward then made the disclosure that deepened the shock. In a documented palace briefing, he had been instructed to confirm a decision already approved through a confidential crown process. The announcement had not originated with him. He was the messenger. But when a second sealed page appeared inside the folder, he declined to discuss its contents, saying only that the change involved a deeper question of eligibility. That was when William was summoned. Edward closed the folder with both hands and remained seated while Charles looked at the document rather than at his brother. The future king was being drawn into a decision that could either settle the crisis or tear the family open behind closed doors. Behind the constitutional language were people who had once sat around the same family tables. Charles was being forced to separate fatherhood from kingship. William was confronting something that could permanently alter his brother's place in royal history. Edward found himself closer to a future he had never publicly sought. And hundreds of miles away, Harry was about to learn that the institution he had left had changed the rules of belonging. Edward understood why he had been placed in the middle. As Charles' younger brother, he was trusted with sensitive family matters, yet he stood outside the deepest wounds between William and Harry. That distance made him useful, but it also made the burden heavier. The dynastic order was no longer just a list of names. It carried the weight of broken relationships, children pulled into adult decisions, and a family struggling to separate duty from love. Charles stared at Harry's name on the revised document longer than anyone in the room expected. The king knew the page represented continuity and a clear constitutional future, but the father inside him saw something else. He saw separation made permanent. Harry was not merely being moved out of an institutional position. Archie and Lilibet were being affected too, and that detail struck him hardest. He lowered the page slowly, saying nothing, while Edward watched his brother's expression tighten. William carried a different kind of pain. In a private conversation with Catherine, he admitted he refused to celebrate anyone being removed. Even if advisors believed the change protected the monarchy's future, the prince understood the pressure now falling on him as heir. He knew exactly whose name was disappearing from the order. Catherine listened carefully. Then she noticed something in his silence that unsettled her. William already knew more than he had said. Edward had learned through a documented palace briefing that Harry had received warnings months earlier. The issue was not simply where he lived or whether he performed public duties. Officials had raised unresolved questions about whether someone remaining inside the succession structure could permanently distance himself from the obligations attached to it. Those concerns had been communicated privately, and Harry had been given opportunities to respond. Catherine pressed William gently. He finally admitted that he had known about one of those warnings before Edward's confirmation. He had carried that knowledge without calling his brother, afraid that any conversation would sound like pressure from the future king rather than concern from William himself. Then he picked up his phone. Harry's old number remained there. William stood beside the window, thumb hovering over the call button while Catherine watched him struggle. For several seconds he seemed ready to make the call. Then he locked the screen. To understand why William could not make that call, the family had to go back to the moment Harry was given one final warning and walked away from it. The succession crisis did not begin with Edward's announcement. Its true beginning came during a private Windsor gathering months earlier, when Harry was confronted with a demand he considered impossible and Charles considered unavoidable. No cameras were present, no public statement followed. Yet one conversation inside Windsor Castle became the point everyone would later identify as the moment reconciliation stopped being emotional and became constitutional. Harry had already spent months receiving private correspondence about his formal relationship with the crown. The letters raised difficult questions about his permanent life abroad, his distance from royal duties, and whether he would remain available during constitutional emergencies. Constitutional contingency planning meant preparing in advance for situations where senior royals might suddenly be required to perform official functions. Charles wanted an agreement that avoided touching succession entirely. He had asked Edward to remain close to the discussions because his younger brother could speak calmly where emotion threatened to take control. Charles believed compromise was still possible. Harry believed the palace wanted submission dressed as cooperation. That difference poisoned almost every exchange between them. The king saw a son who wished to preserve constitutional privilege while rejecting the duties that could someday come with it. Harry saw a father allowing the institution to place conditions on something he believed belonged to him by birth. Edward watched both men speak, then stopped listening, and understood that affection was no longer enough to bridge what had formed between them. The Windsor meeting became the breaking point. Charles placed a written declaration before Harry and asked him to reaffirm that he remained available for constitutional duties connected to his place in the succession. Harry immediately understood what signing it would mean. He read the final paragraph twice. Then he pushed the paper back across the table. "I will not sign it." Edward did not move. Charles looked at the unsigned page, then at his son. Harry rose from the chair and made clear that he would not allow his independent life to be tied to conditions he believed the palace had invented. Charles answered that independence carried consequences when constitutional responsibility remained attached. Neither man raised his voice. That restraint made the moment colder. Harry walked out, leaving the declaration untouched on the table between them. Edward remained beside Charles, watching the monarch stare at the blank signature line. William entered minutes later. He picked up the rejected document and found the warning buried near the end. Continued refusal could trigger a formal eligibility review. The prince understood immediately what that meant. This was no longer pressure. It was a countdown. Months later, that untouched signature line returned between the brothers, this time with far more than reconciliation hanging over it. William had spent months avoiding the conversation because he knew what it might destroy. Harry entered believing his brother had already chosen the crown over him. No aides remained inside the room. No advisors were permitted to soften the language. Between the two brothers lay the document Harry had refused to sign, and beside it sat a revised succession order that could change their children's futures. This was no longer another royal disagreement. This was judgment inside a family. William had requested the meeting before the recommendation became irreversible because he wanted Harry to hear the consequences from someone who shared his blood. The prince knew that once the machinery moved forward, personal explanations would mean far less. Harry arrived convinced it was still pressure, another attempt to push him toward royal obligations he had already rejected. He did not realize how far the process had gone. William explained the contradiction in the simplest terms he could manage. Leaving official royal work had been one decision. Remaining constitutionally available, while refusing the emergency responsibilities tied to that position, was another. The future king said the palace could not pretend those two choices fit together forever. Harry immediately heard something colder. To him, his brother was hiding a family punishment inside institutional language. The argument sharpened when Archie and Lilibet entered the conversation. Harry accused William of allowing his children to lose something they had inherited by birth because their father had chosen a different life. William reacted immediately. He said the children were not being judged for their parents. But he also refused to promise that constitutional status could remain untouched when the responsibility behind it had been rejected. The words landed hard. Harry pushed the revised page across the table. William did not touch it. Then William revealed what Harry had never been told directly. In a documented private exchange with senior advisors, the future king had requested additional time before the review advanced. He had argued that his brother deserved one final chance to reconsider the Windsor Declaration. That delay had been granted. The deadline passed anyway. Harry's anger shifted. William told him the next truth quietly. Charles, not his elder son, had ultimately authorized the review to proceed. The king had waited until the extension expired, then allowed the constitutional process to continue. Harry stared at his brother, realizing he had aimed months of resentment at the wrong person. He asked whether the process could still be stopped. William looked down at the untouched page. He said he had already asked for more time once, and there was none left. Harry had blamed his brother, but the signature carrying the greatest weight belonged to someone far harder to confront. Their father. Charles had spent his life preparing to protect the monarchy. He had never expected that duty to require a decision touching his own son's place in its future. The papers before him were clinical, names and positions and conditions and recommendations, but the consequences were painfully human. Edward watched his brother read the final page twice. William stood several feet away and said nothing. Then Charles reached for the pen, knowing that whatever happened next would be remembered as both royal judgment and paternal loss. The king understood that the succession review had moved beyond family argument. Crown advisors had examined the constitutional questions. Legal recommendations had been prepared, and formal royal approval now stood between debate and action. Charles knew why advisors wanted clarity. He also knew what clarity could cost him. Edward finally asked the question nobody else had dared to raise. Could it be delayed again? The king looked at him for several seconds. He said extensions had already been granted, and every new delay weakened confidence in the process. William heard the answer and lowered his eyes. He understood that his father was no longer deciding whether action would come. He was deciding what mercy could still survive inside it. Then the sealed clause was opened. Charles had preserved one narrow route back. The decision contained a restoration mechanism, a formal path allowing the removed status to be reconsidered if strict constitutional conditions were accepted before the revised order became permanent. William realized immediately that his father had deliberately kept that option away from public discussion. The monarch was closing the door, but the father had refused to lock it completely. Charles signed. He removed his glasses and set the pen down. Edward asked quietly whether it was final. William said it had to be. Nothing more. But the meaning was unmistakable. Harry would now receive the conditions, and whatever he chose next would belong entirely to him. Harry expected anger when the decision arrived. What caught him off guard was the silence that followed. The revised order was no longer a threat. It was real. Archie and Lilibet's names were absent from the active succession list, and Edward's family had moved upward. Back in Britain, nobody celebrated. Edward looked deeply unsettled by the position he had inherited through someone else's loss. Charles withdrew behind a closed door, carrying the weight of what he had authorized. Harry read the formal notice alone. The revised order had already begun moving through the royal household, forcing officials to change briefing documents, ceremonial planning, and contingency records. The decision was no longer confined to one painful family conversation. It was being built into the machinery of the monarchy. Harry folded the notice once, then opened it again when he reached the names of his children. The pain changed immediately. He could accept consequences aimed at him. But seeing Archie and Lilibet removed made the decision feel generational. Then he reached the restoration clause. The mechanism offered one narrow route back, but it required an explicit personal commitment from him to the constitutional duties he had previously rejected. Charles could forgive him privately. The king could even want reconciliation, but neither affection nor paternal regret could restore the children without Harry meeting those conditions himself. Edward felt the same weight from the opposite side. He sat with Sophie and admitted that moving upward brought no sense of triumph. Their family now carried greater constitutional significance, more attention, more responsibility, and a stronger expectation of readiness if the crown ever required them. Sophie understood immediately why that burden felt bitter. Edward's gain existed only because Harry's branch had been pushed away. "This does not feel like moving forward," Edward said. Sophie answered quietly that perhaps it was not supposed to. Catherine saw the danger before William admitted it. In a private conversation, she urged him to contact Harry one final time. Not as heir, not as defender of the crown, simply as a brother. William resisted at first. Too much had already been said through documents and deadlines. Catherine reminded him that this was exactly the problem. William finally agreed. No aides would attend, no papers would sit between them, no constitutional language would be allowed to hide what either man truly felt. The institution had already spoken. Now, two brothers had one final chance to decide whether the family could say something different. For the first time since the crisis began, there was no document on the table. No private secretary waited outside with talking points. William and Harry sat alone as brothers, not as heir and exile, and the absence of palace machinery made the conversation more painful rather than less. William finally admitted that he had feared losing Harry long before the succession changed. Harry answered with something equally difficult. He had feared that returning would mean losing himself. William spoke first. He said he could not ask his brother to return to a life he no longer wanted and would not pretend that leaving had been easy. But the future king also refused to treat constitutional responsibility as a decoration. A place in the succession carried expectations, even if the person holding it never came close to the throne. Harry listened without interrupting. This time there was no official language to hide behind. He answered with the truth William had feared. Protecting his family's independence mattered more to him than preserving a position he never expected to inherit. He did not want Archie and Lilibet raised under obligations he had spent years trying to escape. The decision hurt, but returning simply to recover status would feel like surrendering the life he had fought to build. Then Harry reached across the table. William had left the restoration folder unopened between them, deliberately refusing to pressure him. Harry placed one hand over it and closed it, and then left it closed. William looked at his brother and understood immediately. Harry would not challenge the revised succession arrangement. He would not sign the Restoration Declaration merely to recover rank. He would not ask Charles to reverse the decision through private affection. William nodded, but one promise remained. Whatever happened constitutionally, Archie and Lilibet would never become lesser members of the family in his eyes. Harry looked at him for several seconds before quietly accepting that distinction. The crown could define responsibility. It could not dictate every human bond. That agreement changed the crisis. What had begun as resistance became acceptance. And once Harry's choice became known, the argument escaped palace walls entirely. By morning, the story no longer belonged to Windsor. It belonged to breakfast tables, television studios, crowds outside palace gates, and newspaper stands across Britain. Some saw discipline, others saw cruelty, but almost everyone understood the same thing. A line that had seemed fixed by birth had suddenly become something else entirely. Edward watched the coverage beside Sophie and grew more uncomfortable with every passing hour. Some commentators called him the biggest beneficiary. He rejected that language immediately. Sophie heard him say that no one in their household considered another branch of the family being removed a victory. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction became painfully concrete. A small crowd gathered near the railings as newspaper sellers held up a front page dominated by 3 words: Harry out. Edward rises. One woman read the headline, folded the paper quietly, and lowered it without speaking. Another raised her phone and photographed it. The moment captured the divide perfectly. One royal future had been reduced to a headline while the emotional cost remained invisible. Charles heard something worse. A broadcaster described the decision as a king choosing the crown over his son. The king reached for the remote and switched off the television. He did not challenge the words. He did not defend himself. He simply sat in silence, knowing that whatever constitutional reasoning existed behind the decision, millions would remember the story in painfully personal terms. Then the palace released the confirmation that ended the speculation. Through a documented official statement, it was made clear that Harry had chosen not to activate the restoration process. He would not sign the conditions required to regain active succession status. The choice was now his as much as theirs. Edward read the statement beside Sophie and understood that the movement was permanent. Charles understood it, too. The rankings were now settled. What remained was the harder verdict, the human cost hidden behind those newly arranged names. In the end, there was no triumphant winner. Edward moved closer to the crown without wanting another man's loss. William protected the constitutional future he had been raised to inherit, yet watched his brother step farther from it. Charles secured the clarity his advisors demanded, but paid for it as a father. And Harry made the most personal choice of all. He accepted removal rather than return under conditions he could no longer live with. The succession was clearer. The family was not the same. Edward accepted the new reality without celebration. Inside his own household, he made clear to Sophie and his children that moving higher in the succession did not mean gaining a prize. It meant greater constitutional importance, stronger expectations, and a heavier duty to remain ready if the crown ever required them. Sophie understood why he spoke with such restraint. Their family had moved forward only because another part of the family had stepped away. Harry made his own decision just as firmly. He declined the restoration pathway and accepted that Independence carried permanent constitutional consequences. Archie and Lilibet would remain outside the active order, but Harry believed protecting the life he had built for them mattered more than recovering a place in a system he no longer wished to serve. William understood the cost from another direction. The prince had protected the future structure he believed the monarchy required, yet nothing about that achievement felt like victory. His final private conversation with Harry had not repaired everything, but it had prevented constitutional disagreement from becoming total personal rejection. He could not restore his brother's place without conditions. He could still refuse to treat him as someone erased from the family. Charles carried the hardest memory. The king returned alone to the unsigned Windsor Declaration that had triggered the entire crisis. He held it once, then placed it in a private drawer. He did not destroy it. That choice made a difference. The monarch had accepted that Harry would not return under those conditions, but the father refused to erase the evidence that reconciliation had once been attempted. Edward's confirmation had meant something larger than simply moving forward on a list. Birth had created a place in the succession, but in this chapter, continued responsibility had determined whether that place remained active. Harry chose independence. Edward accepted an unexpected burden. William accepted the loneliness of inheritance. Charles learned that not even a king could preserve every bond while protecting every institution. The decision was final. The crown endured because each man had ultimately accepted the price of the life he had chosen, and that made it permanent. What made Edward's role in all of this uniquely painful was not the constitutional mechanics. It was the position he occupied inside the family, close enough to Charles to be trusted, far enough from the core wound to be useful, and yet near enough to both brothers to feel every consequence. He had not engineered the outcome. He had not pushed for the review. He had not written the restoration clause or argued for its inclusion. He had simply been asked to be present, and being present had placed him at the center of the story the world was now telling about his family. Sophie watched him in the days after the announcement with the attention of someone who has shared enough of a life with a person to read the weight they carry before they speak. She did not press him to explain what he was feeling. She had known him long enough to understand that he processes the hardest things by going quiet, and that quiet was its own kind of answer. When he finally did speak, what he said to her was not about the succession or the constitutional process or the institutional machinery that had moved around them. He said that he hoped Harry understood that the distance between their families had never been something he had sought. Sophie told him that Harry was not the only one who needed to hear that. Edward wrote to his nephew in the weeks that followed. The letter was not long. It did not discuss succession arrangements or formal positions or the conditions attached to the restoration pathway. It said only that whatever had changed on paper, nothing had changed in how he thought about Harry as family. He did not know whether the letter would be welcomed. He sent it anyway because the alternative was allowing procedural silence to say something he had not chosen. Harry read it. His response came several weeks later, also brief, also personal, and it did not mention the succession. It mentioned a memory from years earlier, a specific afternoon neither of them had spoken about in a very long time, and it ended with 3 words that told Edward everything he needed to know about where they stood. We are family. That exchange happened entirely outside the institutional record. No palace official documented it. No private secretary was copied. No communications team reviewed the language before either letter was sent. 2 men connected by blood and history, and the particular complication of loving a family that had just formally rearranged itself around them, choosing to say something true to each other in the one format the machinery of the monarchy could not reach. The succession order remained as it had been settled. The names on the list reflected decisions that neither sentimentality nor private correspondence could undo. But the family that existed behind the list, the one made of people rather than positions, was still making its own choices about who mattered to whom and how much. Charles found the letter in Edward's possession sometime later, not through any formal channel, but because Edward showed it to him. The king read it slowly. He did not comment on the constitutional implications. He asked only one question, whether Harry had seemed well when he wrote it. Edward said that he had seemed like himself, which was the most honest answer available. Charles put the letter down and sat with that for a moment. Then he said that was enough. It was not everything. It was not resolution or reunion or the repair of what had broken, but it was enough for the people sitting in that room. And enough is sometimes the only form of forward that a family can honestly claim. The succession was settled. The family was not the same. And the space between those two facts was where the real story lived. Not in the official record, but in the letters that moved quietly between people who had no choice but to find their own way through the same loss from different directions.